Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a virtual program of the Commonwealth Club program. My name is Shugato Ray, and I'm an associate professor, South and Southeast Asian Art, History of Art Department at UC Berkeley. Today's program is the second in a series of programs created through a partnership between the Townsend Center for the Humanities at Berkeley and the Commonwealth Club. The focus of the series is catastrophe and the essential role that story and storytelling play in helping us face and survive catastrophes. The goal is to share knowledge and renew hope at this critical time by discussing literary and visual accounts of catastrophic change through history. Interestingly, this program was in development before the coronavirus crisis began. Now I speak to you from the San Francisco Bay Area, which is one of the first regions in the country to go into a lockdown, and it's just beginning to emerge. This new series of programs seek to remind us that it is not the first time that human societies have faced catastrophic collapse. Today's program focuses on the relationship between the natural world and the sacred realm, especially as it has developed in India over the last several centuries of civilization and the rise of the Anthropocene era. Joining me today for the conversation is Ranu Mukherjee. Ranu is a visual artist who makes painting, animation, and large-scale installations. And before jumping in, I want to remind people that you can ask questions. Please post your questions in the YouTube chat area, and they will be forwarded to me. Okay, let's start, Ranu.
Thank you, Sugata. Hello. Good to see you. Hello, everybody who's out there, wherever you are. Thanks, Commonwealth Club and the Townsend Center for having us. Yeah, I was excited to do this before, but now it seems really prescient. And I'm going to just show one project of mine to get the conversation started. Before I show slides, I wanted to show this piece of fabric because I can in this format, which I can't do on stage. This is a print, and it is a pattern that I made that comes from images of the youth climate marches in the last three years or so, abstracted into a pattern and printed onto a piece of sari cloth. This is a Jamdani sari, which is made on a jacquard loom. And this is something that I do in order to make raw material for the collage works that I do. And so there's a relationship between the loom, the jacquard loom, which is sort of a proto-digital technology, and the digital information that I'm printing onto it. So those things are having a conversation in that print, and I wanted to show you that because it's a little bit harder to see in the slides that I'm going to show. But now I'm going to share my screen and go on to the slide presentation. Here we go. So here we have the first slide. This is a slide of the project I'm going to talk about, which is called A Bright Stage, and it was on view at the De Young Museum in middle of 2018 through early 2019, so about 6 months. And the project was installed in Willsey Court, which is a public space at the center of the museum. So the invitation to do this project came through Claudia Schmuckley, who is the curator in charge there, and she really just invited me, and she's done this with other artists, to just inhabit this space with a piece of art. And the middle wall there is about 50 by 30 feet. So the space is quite monumental. And it is a public space again, which means that there's no entry fee. So it is technically a public space. And when she invited me to do this, besides thinking I need to paint the walls a color to take it out of white space and I thought a lot about the idea of bringing the outside into the museum. And I also thought a lot about public voices and public action. And I thought about the banyan tree, which is what I'm really going to talk about now. And maybe I'm going to be a storyteller for a little bit to talk about this plant, which is a plant. The banyan tree is a really incredible natural form that I've been thinking about for a while, but the scale of that space really gave me the opportunity to spend some time doing some research and think about it some more. The banyan is a species of fig tree, and it is sacred in many cultures, but particularly in India and other parts of the Indian subcontinent. And this is an image of a cotton procession moving underneath the tree, spending time setting up a caravan, getting shelter and shade. And the tree, so for a long time, has been a source of shade, a source of shelter, and now currently is sort of the site of many public parks. So there's one outside of Calcutta that is like a sort of small city scale tree. So it's one tree. And one of the things that's fascinating about it is the way that it grows. So it grows outwards and down. So it starts with its fig tree. So a bird will take a fig from one tree and go and poop a seed out into another tree. And then the epiphyte will start in the crux of a tree that's already existent. And the roots will start to grow downward and outward. And as it grows down, it often strangles the host tree. So, in a sense, the tree is both sacred and it's also this kind of monstrous plant. And it's what I was thinking of as it has its own sort of colonial mentality. So, it's a tree that is the home to many species, but it also has um, a colonial way of propagating itself. So it, in my project, sort of became like this metaphor for where ecology and culture come together, and also uh, talking about its role in, or the role that it ended up playing in these kind of um, confrontations between imperial or colonial power and indigeneity. So this is an image of a person in India being hung by the British soldiers in the 1800s because they were rebelling against the colony. And so they used these trees and the limbs of these trees because they were sacred. They could do a kind of double kind of injury on a population. It's a handy because it has these branches, but also, there's a way in which this has happened in the United States as well, that these trees become, because they're sacred, the symbolic power of the violence is ever stronger. So those were some of the starting points for this project of wanting to bring a kind of natural form into the museum, to think about these sorts of how this sort of idea might exist today in terms of the public voices that we are hearing and who's trying to find ground and how. I'm just going to walk a little bit through the project with these slides. So this was the left wall. Some of the images, so these pieces are all made on linen with cloth elements that were used as collage. And some of them are more tree-like than others. So there's a sort of, abstraction to the idea of the tree. The tree was like both a protagonist and a guide, as well as a formal device. This particular piece, some of them had these line drawings. And so there was a way in which you could see the project from lots of different points of views. You could see it from the ground, but also from these second level windows. This drawing was a drawing of a protester holding up an image of a journalist named Gauri Lankesh, who was killed a few years ago for her pro-democracy journalism, speaking out against Hindu fundamentalism in India now. And so this was a protest where the people were holding up the image of her face, a little bit like the I Am Trayvon protests that happened in the United States. So, and then some of the pieces, these elements of fabric you see on this piece, this pattern was actually made of the images of the vigils for the same person. And so, what I was doing here was making these patterns, printing them onto the fabric, and then using the fabric as collage material to think about the ways that these histories will kind of grow also. They grow out. I mean, I loved the idea of thinking about the pattern of growth, the outward and down movement of the tree, and also the way that media images kind of appear and we think about them and then they disappear, and but that maybe the things that happen there have another life and are kind of continuing on into the future in other ways. So that's a close-up of that piece. And then on the center wall, I was using, so each of these pieces had a different shape. I was using images of the women's marches on this wall in some of these patterns, and March for Our Lives, and the also the Dakota Pipeline water protection protests that were happening at a time. So again, the sort of cultural and the ecological go hand in hand in a lot of my work, and I'm trying really hard to make work where the ecological impetus is a kind of agency, and also that the kind of nature and culture can't be separated. So this is these line drawings were images of some of the people who are doing those protests that are coming out of the news, and the patterns are associated with those images also. I was thinking of this in a way that because of the trees being home to the spirits in lots of cultures, like could I make something that functioned that way for these images? So, you know, while we may not be seeing the images that we saw 6 months ago in the media, maybe the patterns or the sort of futurist or the futurity of those kind of movements, and how maybe just like the prop roots of the banyan, they're sort of looking for ground and looking for a way to root into culture. I guess that's a hopeful way of thinking about things, but yeah, I think that those hopeful things are important. This one shows you some of the places where I chose to make the work very tree-like. So some of the linen pieces were very angular and abstract, while others really clearly related to the shape of a tree. Some of them didn't have any collage at all, like this blue one. And then there were videos which were a series of extinct birds that were forming and unforming in a sequence. And so there was sort of some movement happening in the room, which was actually, it began as I was sort of thinking of them as spirits in these trees, and this idea that the dead can continue to speak. But also Michael DeYoung, who started the museum, had a collection of stuffed birds. So I was thinking about this idea of the 19th century museum and sort of the colonial roots of the museum and how those sorts of histories carry on into the present. This is a detail that I put in here because this is an image of some people. These were migrants that were waiting at the southern border of the United States around the time that I was doing this work. I started making these line drawings the summer before the 2016 election. And it was a time when I was really having, it was just really overwhelming, everything that was going on. And then when the elections came, it was even more overwhelming. And so part of my way of handling all of that was to trace these images of things. And I was thinking a lot about the landscape and the futurity that these people, like wherever the people end up, will be communicate will affect the future of that place, and that they will add something to that place. So also it was like, can I put them in a safe space in my work, even if they're not in a safe space in their life? So, you know, now of course I'm thinking a lot about the people that are stuck now, either in cages or at one side of the border, and how those migrations and the sort of issues of climate change are totally interwoven. This wall is another one where the tree shapes are really clear, and there's also these patterns on that wall. A lot of them came from the migrations that were happening in the Mediterranean Sea at the time. So I used a lot of the images of the boats and things. And those are just sort of traces that people can't see, but for me, it's really important they're there. So then zooming out, you know, just this was a sort of a situation again where people could see the work from all different kinds of angles. And I wanted it to be a place where people, again, the video was creating a kind of movement. So it was about bringing a sort of animated quality into this space, bringing the outside in, and also making an image of landscape that was using this kind of very non-pastoral plant, which is kind of monstrous and has this really rich history. To, you know, also just think about the way that historically landscape has been in some cultures a force that is about sort of containment and domestication. And so I was really trying to sort of do the opposite, and yet include these sort of the idea of like the public and public space and public voices. Yeah, so that's what I have to say about that project. And then when I was invited to do this talk with Sugata, I was really excited because his book, Climate Change and the Art of Devotion, was introduced to me through this invitation. And I read it and was, it was amazing to me to read about, this history of another climate change, another period of climate change, and a period in an art history where there was this agency inherent in people's relationship to the landscape. So, Sugata, please take it away. I'd like to hear more about your book.
Well, thank you, Ranu, and very kind of you. Um, I hope we return to some of these conversations as part of a discussion later in terms of thinking about both indigenous activism, but also how one rethinks the history of colonialism and the relationship between colonialism and sacred groves. So, as Ranu mentioned, my book, which came out last year, focuses on climate change in this particular pilgrimage site in North India called Braj, a site that was supposed to be where the god Krishna is believed to have spent his youth. Now, incidentally, George Harrison composed It Is He after he visited Braj, and that's why I wrote the book. But no, but I mean, I'm a big Beatles fan. But more than that, I think what is so interesting about this site, and you can see it in this image of devotees circumambulating a mountain or little hillock, is that in the 16th century, a new sort of devotion develops in Braj, in which it's not just the image or the icon in the temple, but the natural environment, the rocks, the forest, even the dust of Braj is considered sacred. So much as one would go to a Hindu temple and circumambulate the temple, here we see pilgrims circumambulate a hillock. Now, what is more interesting is that this new practice of devotion emerges precisely at a point where there are massive monsoon failures, El Nino induced monsoon failures in Africa, in South America, in Asia. And scholars now call it the Little Ice Age. So, on the one hand, you have this rise of devotion, of worshipping the natural environment. On the other hand, you have massive monsoon failures. So, one of the chapters in this book focuses on what is pertinent to our discussion, the idea of sacred groves. So, the next image, what I have is this very interesting project by William Roxburgh, who's considered the founding father of Indian botany, a Scottish surgeon who works in India. This is a book called Plants of the Coast of Coromandel, South India, and it includes illustrations of plants that are indigenous to South India. Now, this is a moment of global botany. This is a moment when these groves were being built in Braj. You have a new technique of governance, a new way of controlling the natural environment of colonies, not just South Asia, but in South America, in Africa. The expansion of colonial plantations that support tea, rubber, indigo, opium. But all of these colonial plantations that are being set up in the colonies also leads to massive deforestation, and the natural environment is suffering. The people are suffering. So part of this larger global botany and colonialism, and it's very similar to today's biotech and agro companies that steal indigenous knowledge from across the world in the name of science and medicine. So in the same way, William Roxburgh collects the bio knowledge from the Coromandel Coast, and that produces modern science in Europe. So in this moment of global botany, colonialism, environmental devastation, I turn to the pilgrimage site of Braj and I look at these groves that are being built. So the next image, for instance, shows this particular Ranu, can we move to the next image, please? I'm sorry, this is so difficult to manage via Zoom. So this is a fabulous painting by an artist called Nihal Chand, based in Kishangarh, the kingdom of Kishangarh in West. The previous slide, please, Ranu.
This one, right?
Thank you. So we have colonial botany, we have deforestation. And at this point, what is so interesting is that you have the rise of new poetry and painting that describes Braj as this pristine forest where Krishna and Radha spend their time. They roam this wilderness. They're part of this verdant sacred groves. So as deforestation is increasing, as colonial presence is increasing in the subcontinent, a poetic imagination becomes more prominent. And in the painting by this particular artist called Nihal Chand, we see Krishna and Radha on the left, lying in this sacred grove, beautiful brushwork, and the density of forest that is being made visible through pigment. And this is the beginning of what we call the Anthropocene era, the theme that we were planning to talk about. This is precisely the era of our current geological period in which human activity has been the dominant force of the environment on the environment. So what we have is the rise of the Anthropocene, massive deforestation, colonialism, and then in the sacred site, you have the rise of this new poetics of Krishna worship, which is focused on gardens. So when I was looking at these paintings, I went to Braj and I was trying to find these gardens. Where are these gardens that are depicted in painting, that are talked about in literature over and again? How did these sweeping alterations in the region's agro landscape transform the notion of the bower where Krishna and Radha would spend their time? I found a few. I found one, and the next slide shows that. Rani, can we have the next slide, please?
I think there's a lag because it's up on my screen.
Oh.
Is it there now?
No. Okay, super. Oh, again, we moved back. No? Thank you. So this is the sacred garden that's established in the 18th century. And on the left, you can see aerial view. So this is dense urban center. The sacred site was in the heart of the mercantile world of North India. So massive urban population, there's deforestation. But at this precise moment, you have the creation of this garden where apparently Krishna and Radha still spend their evening. So at night, the doors are shut so that we mere mortals do not disturb Krishna and Radha in their nocturnal tryst. But in the daytime, you can visit the garden and you can see how the trees are being shaped in a very interesting way. They're very small. So when I was there, I had to actually bend. I had to go through the trees. It's almost as if it was recreating this sacred forest of poetry and painting. So it's an effect of unspoiled nature and wilderness that is produced through gardening, architecture, poetry. Once we entered the sacred garden through the gateway, immediately we find a mass of jasmine creepers. And we have to make our way through this dense vines, imagining ourselves as Radha looking for Krishna. But all of this is happening when there is massive climate change and deforestation. So what I found very interesting about this site is that at this time of Anthropocene climate change, an imagination, a mythopoetic imagination of sacred gardens are emerging in Braj. But one has to be careful because this is not the actual natural vegetation of the region. Because remember, this is completely deforested. It's an urban center. It's a suburb of Delhi, literally. So, but it's an imagination of sacrality. It's an imagination of the natural world, and we as devotees, as pilgrims, we are asked to play along. And there's a particular notion of lila or play, which essentially means that it's a very corporeal bodily experience. We walk through we smell the jasmines, we have to bend, the creepers catch on our clothes. So this was one of the chapters that focused on the idea of the sacred grove and how at a moment of industrial revolution, at a moment of economic transformations, the rise of modernity, there is an attempt to reimagine what the natural environment is. So this project and this book allows me to think about how does one talk about environmental discourse? And I want to sort of end this segment with a proposition. Now, in contemporary environmental discourse, the past is always seen as a period of ecological plenitude, where humans lived close to nature. We always think about the past as this Arcadian, bucolic world where everything was good and people lived closer to nature, and then came modernity and everything was disrupted. But climate change, it's a longevity problem. We have to think of deep time, long durations, not 5 years, 10 years, but at a scale of 500 years. So what this allows us to do is when we start thinking of sacred spaces, sacred groves in specific, there's a way in which we think about it as unchanging, primordial, untouched by modernity. Whether we think about Native American sacred sites in the US or we think about groves in Africa, what this particular garden reminded me is that these groves were not representative of the region's vegetation. They were simulated gardens, they were artificial gardens. So rather than idealizing sacred biohabitats as static and unchanging, what I propose is a post-romantic approach to the study of sacred sites and plants. One that does not fetishize the pre-modern, that is, one does not make the pre-modern into this other, into this sort of a bucolic space of alterity from the worlds that we live in, but one also that takes the resilience of religious conceptions of flora, fauna, the natural environment very seriously. And that has resonances in our world today. We see it globally. If you could go to the next slide, Rani.
Did it go?
Yes.
Okay.
So think about North Dakota. Ran was talking about how she works with this idea of the water warriors. What I found fascinating about the protests in North Dakota was the mobilization of a Lakota expression, the expression Miniwikoni, water is life. Now, this is a protest of the present, but the activists engage and work with pre-modern philosophical systems, Lakota philosophies of vital water, where water is not just a resource, water is not just histories of water typically focus on governance, but here it's a way of life, it's a philosophical system. And what this particular movement in North Dakota made visible to me was that there are other notions of the environment that at certain points would intersect with modernist ideas of nature as resource or wilderness. Think about John Muir and the wilderness movement here in California. Vast, pristine. But at some other times, it offers other ways of thinking interactions between humans and the non-human that is not bound by modern notions of what the subject is and who the object is, and the subject-object binary that is fundamental to modernity gets unraveled, challenged by let's say a term like a Lakota term like Miniwikoni, or even thinking about this relationship between plants and humans in India. So that was what my book was trying to do, was trying to think of other histories of environmentalism that is not limited to a certain presentist understanding of the past. The past is very complex, very rich. And I think that was what the book was trying to do. Ranu, do you want to?
That's the next slide, but I was excited about maybe talking a little bit more just about the idea. I've recently been reading Amitav Ghosh's work, and I think what you're saying reminds me a lot of The Great Derangement, where he talks about this sort of way in which we have to kind of try to think bigger or think in a more epic way. And his conversation is really about literature and modernist literature, and the way in the West, a lot of the modernist literature had us sort of, or had the writers basically making the individual experience the bigger, like the everyday was everything, and everything was coming from this personal point of view. And that the Indian epics had a more a sort of situation where there are these like more non-human agencies. So I'm curious about, you know, thinking about this period that you talk about in your book, where there's a drought, but people are making images of water. You know, there's a deforestation, but people are making these images of these really lush forests. And like how, you know, what that's a very different move than, say, making a documentary, making something about exactly how things are.
Right. No, and I think Amitabh's work sort of really was seminal, and what he was trying to what he articulated so beautiful in the book and called The Great Derangement was that climate change is a crisis of the imagination.
Yeah.
It's a crisis of how do we tell stories, and I really love it that this particular series is called Storytelling and Catastrophes, and storytelling, whether it's in literary form or visual form. I think storytelling and the role of imagination in trying to understand how we think about the climate change and how we write the histories or paint the histories or make or annotate the histories of climate change. And I sort of want to, I mean, responding to Ranu's question, what we see on the screen are a photograph from Bombay and a image of the Canton waterfront, Guangzhou. So thinking about trees, that's returning to the broader theme of our conversation today. Uh, Colonial botany was all about managing. It was all about ordering. It was making sense of the landscape, making it visible, creating vistas of governance, of power. So, again, what we saw in Bombay, Shanghai, Benin, Hong Kong was the planting of banyan trees as a way of managing the environment of the colony. A specific, very specific ecological regime, a vista, a view of governance and imperial control. But there's a lot of scholarship on colonial governance and the way in which colonial gardens, you mentioned the Botanical Garden in Calcutta, and how these gardens were a way of managing the natural landscape. I think what the epics or what other forms of storytelling offer us is a way of thinking non-human interactions that is not just about domination, that is not just about ordering, managing, taming the natural environment. And what happens when these trees resist us? Can we write a history of trees resisting human management? Can we think of trees running wild? My favorite image, the next one, is Run. Can you move to the next one, please?
I did.
Oh, you did? Okay, we're moving in
Sorry,
different
there is
time zones.
kind of a
This is one of my favorite pictures. It's a
got it.
colonial depot in Calcutta, the capital of the British Empire, that the heart of empire, the jewel in the crown, and so forth. But what we see here is banyan trees literally running wild. Can we go back? Running wild. These very trees that were planted by the colonial government to create a vista, a view, now have their own agency. They are taking over. They are rewriting colonialism. And what sort of a art history or visual practice can emerge if we start taking the plants seriously? I mean, in art history, it's a history it's a species history. It's a history of artists, patrons, audiences. But what sort of an art history can emerge if we go beyond our species boundaries and start taking the tree seriously and the ruins of empire? And I mean, I find this image so poetic that the ruins of empire are now being controlled by this banyan tree that extends all over this particular colonial structure. And this idea of animism, that is the agentiveness or agency of plants, of rocks, of animals, of non-humans, it's everywhere. The next slide. We all know this. the Lord of the Rings, the Ents of the Middle Earth, who are fighting catastrophic forces of large-scale deforestation, or we can move to Bollywood. Since this is a talk on India, how can we not talk about Bollywood? Aishwarya Rai was apparently, quote unquote, apparently, ritually married to a tree before her marriage to Abhishek Bachchan in order to counter the negative effects of being born under an adverse planetary constellation, Mangalik. So you have, whether you have Lord of the Rings or Aishwarya Rai marrying a tree. Now, Amitabh Bachchan, Aishwarya's father-in-law, completely denounced this, said that they are not a superstitious family, they are not a backward family. Ash did not marry a tree unless you think Abhishek is a tree. Now, I was very intrigued by Amitabh the Big B's response to this rumor that Ash was had to marry a tree. It really hit at something. What it hit at was a longer history, a 19th century history of colonial anthropology, and this idea of animism, that the primitive, that is the colonized, who are like children. They cannot distinguish between animate and inanimate beings. So the Big B was very serious that they are not a superstitious family, they're not a big backward family, and all these rumors are just rubbish. But what sort of worldviews emerge if we take that seriously? If we take that rocks are animate, plants are animate, and returning to Minnie Riccone, the Lakota term, can these terms, these ideas, these notions of the agency of the non-human have resonances today to fight climate change? Mm-hmm. The role of the past, the role of the epics, and that for me was a question. But I think I've spoken for around 30. But Ranu, I wonder if that sort of idea of the resonance of, oh, we've had enough of Big B. I think we can move on.
About to stop the slides.
Yeah.
Hang on. I gotta get my technology rolling here. Okay. There we go.
Yeah. So I wonder if this notion of the agentive or the agency of plants plays out in your work, and how do you engage with this idea? Because art history is very species centric.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's something that I'm like, since doing that project, I'm trying to do more and more, and it's lots of different kinds of maybe non-human agencies enter the work. It's also really a question that then you have to really tangle with the history of representation, and where does the sort of pictorial and where does depiction come in? And so if you have something that's kind of like, I try to think of this tree as being a protagonist. And in that particular instance at the DeYoung, the tree could have a form that had some resonance with the form of the tree itself. But then when does it become abstracted into something else? And so, there are moments in the work where maybe, the tree is actually still a protagonist, but nobody can see it visually as a sort of representation. So I think the question about, using, like having something other than human have an agency, in some ways I think that that's what's happening all the time when you're making work. I mean, I think that you're like, when you're in tune with things, there's all of these different kinds of entities that speak to you or speak through you or something like that. If you're letting your conscious mind go for a little bit and get into these things. But I also think that there's something about just questioning the representation of the landscape itself. So I've done this in a bunch of different ways, and the banyan tree is one of the figures. It's been like a protagonist. I've also done work where I've tried to have people, like for instance, dancers, rolling around in the ash that happened in the recent fires in California. And so it's another way of like connecting with the landscape that's through a catastrophe, but that also is something that how do you sort of connect with these realms of uncertainty without becoming completely traumatized to the point where you can't act? So I think that that's a really big question. And I think if you have a relationship with other sorts of life forms, it seems more doable. I mean,
Right.
or something like that,
Yeah. And I also think that art practice, given the very material nature of art making, I mean, it's fundamentally an engagement with the agentiveness of other
Right,
forms. I mean,
right.
pigments have their own agentiveness.
Yeah.
However much you force color,
Mhm.
color has its own agentiveness. So I think, in a way, I find art history and art practice really central to thinking about these debates on vibrant matter that have emerged in the recent past, about the idea of materiality. And also, I wonder, I mean, as someone who thinks about painting very seriously, I mean, how would you, could we talk about, let's say, the material, the agentiveness of pigment? I mean, I wouldn't say that the pigment has agency in that notion of that it has a subject or a political will, but it certainly forces the artist to move in a certain direction. Even so, I wonder if that sort of work.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it does, there's sort of so many physical properties of the pigment itself, like where the thing about where it comes from and the different minerals and, but for me, it's the it's the it's the space. It becomes like a space that's not neutral
Right,
in some way. So part of the reason that I needed to paint those walls at De Young was to make the place into this, make a kind of environment with which to collage. And so when I start making a piece of work, I always start with what's the color, the ground, which I really do associate with ground. Like, what's the relation? So this question of figure ground that is sort of completely part of what a painting is, you
right,
know, is that the ground becomes a forceful environment through color, through chroma and and I do use powdered pigment very specifically because, you have to really pay attention to it. It's not just kind of coming out of a tube. Like, you have to mix it up and then you have to figure out exactly what that shade is doing. And I don't know how to describe what it's doing also. Like, I can't, it's not symbolic. It's not like I'm using red because it's an angry color or something. Like, it's, I don't think about it like that. I do think of it as a sort of force. Um,
right. And I think that, I mean, only recently has art history taken the force of pigment seriously, and it'll really change the ways, because essentially how we think about art history and its enlightenment roots, it's really about the human species. When I say it's our way of controlling, whether you're a sculptor and you control stone, and stone that the fact that the stone has its own process, and the stone has to be thought through its own vitality. And I
right.
think these sort of questions, in a way, also take us back to a certain non-Eurocentric ways of thinking art making, and thinking about art making in which it is not just about how we can control, dominate, and order, whether it's pigment or the garden or stone. And that, I think, in a way, opens up the question of indigenous epistemologies, where you like we think about uh, Lakota philosophical systems, and how these philosophical systems can offer other ways of thinking histories of water or stone or pigment.
Yeah,
But
because there's all this listening culture that's attached to them. So like, and there's a culture of time that's different, like from, like, I mean, I have to say I put down a ground, it'll take me until I figure out what is next. I mean, I have to leave the ground to sit there for a little while before I can actually put something else there. Almost like you have to listen to, and I think that those kinds of indigenous methodologies are also like have a lot to do with, that kind of listening.
right,
Speaking of which, Where are we? Do you think we have questions that we should go to, or?
I would, yeah, let's do that. Let's do
Yeah,
that. So I have
I'm
been
just
instructed that I will be getting questions
okay,
from.
good.
So
Okay,
maybe this is a time where we segue, and for those who are joining us, I mean, please join in the conversation.
yeah, if anyone has questions. I just
Comments.
want to ask one thing, if we don't have questions yet, just about the moment that we're in, because I remember when we were talking and preparing for this, I was thinking about this idea of trees being the lungs of the planet, and this sort of idea that's around about, um, just that we have this situation that is being shaped by a virus that attacks the lungs, and this idea of the breath and the air and how important and central that's become in terms of our thinking at the moment. And I remember you talking about doing some work around St. Helena and this
Yeah,
idea. I was wondering if you could
yeah,
just,
absolutely. I mean, that's a very interesting question.
yeah,
The idea of gardens or forests being the lungs of the planet, and the irony of this is that it's actually a colonial intervention. Uh,
idea.
the idea of conservation, the idea that protecting forests. So it begins with in Saint Vincent in the Caribbean, when I was talking about El Nino droughts, the El Nino monsoon failures, and that was devastating the natural environment. And it was this moment that the colonial authorities decided to create protected forest. So this idea of a protected forest that we are so familiar with, whether it's in California, in the US, which we assume begins in the 20th century or the late 19th century. So the scholarship on conservation, forest conservation, sort of point towards the wilderness movement in California as a beginning, but it's actually there's a longer history. So the law was put into force in St. Helena, India, in the Caribbean, and because of the El Nino droughts, and this idea that if we created forests, the lungs of the planet, protected forests that would help rainfall and thus avert agrarian crisis. So these were not pro-environment. This was a very selfish policy
Right.
because there was massive agrarian crises happening because of the droughts. There was an assumption that if we protect forests, that we would produce that there would be rainfall, and that would lead to uh, a better uh, agriculture. Now, Edmund Burke, for instance, the political theorist Edmund Burke, too refers to the high mortality rate in India because of the 1791 drought in his critique of his East India Company. And the botanist that I began with, the Scottish botanist, William Roxburgh, was studying droughts in the subcontinent and studying climate change. So the study of climate change begins in the 18th century, and conservation, as we know it today, begins in the 18th century with these attempts to create forests. So it's a very interesting history, and that for better or for worse, the creation of the wilderness movement is part and parcel of colonialism and part and parcel of that history of deforestation and afforestation at the same time.
Right. Right.
But what for me is also interesting about this history is that, and we see it play out today in many parts of the world, that the creation of a protected forest is at the cost are the indigenous communities who live there. So if you think about Yosemite, when the John Muir created the wilderness movement, who got affected?
Mm.
The Native American population who were living there for many years. And this guy was a racist. He essentially said that the Native American people who have been historically living here and with such minimal effect on the environment was the problem.
Right.
So I think what is also one has to remember that afforestation or protecting forests in a way affects the indigenous communities who live around there. And I mean, only a few days back, I was reading this essay in the New York Times about tigers, and the tiger in the Bronx Museum had COVID, but the tiger in a national forest in India also had COVID. So, and remember that what is interesting about the national tiger reserves in India is that it's the largest population of tigers in the wild. So immediately what the government does is to protect the tigers. They ask the local villagers who live around the protected forests, who live on subsistence, who gather honey and etc. from the forest reserves. Immediately, the government says that they should be removed. So it has always been that these communities who live in these forests, in these areas, who are being affected the most by this sort of North American variety of wilderness movement, or if you go back, the sort of colonial idea. It's a form of colonialism. It's a form of arbitrarily selecting a piece of land and saying that this should be protected at the cost of. And there are scholars who call for a new way of thinking environmentalism, which they would say it's environmentalism of the poor, rather than importing the wilderness movement, the North American variety. Scholars have argued that we have to think about other practices of environmentalism in the global South, or in Africa, Asia, and South America, which is not about making migrants or forcing people out of their local context in the name of protecting animals and forests. And we see it playing out in Palestine. We see it played out in many parts of the world today. And it's interesting. So on the one hand, it's a form of greenwashing. On the one hand, you're like, yeah, we are protecting forests, we're building these forests, but at whose cost? The cost is always the poor. The poor always bear the cost of pro or anti-environmental practices. Okay, I'm looking at my phone.
Okay.
But I mean, I also would, going back to your project, and I was very intrigued by this idea of the banyan tree as both protective, but also the space where you would have, let's say, the so-called mutineers of 1857 or being hung there. So I think there is this very interesting play between violence and protection, of benevolence and dystopia that's associated with the trees. I wonder if you would.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems to be a site, because I guess it's like when we were talking before about this idea of the sacred and what happens when, something becomes sacred, that it always has this, I mean, depending on who's going to kind of like wield it, if it's wieldable, it always has this problem. But it's also, if I'm just taking it as a figure, the fact that it actually strangles its host, for me was I mean, it's historically been this site. It also is, I think, in the Kikuyu people, I've read several stories from different places, right? So there's like, I know in different parts of Africa, the same tree, which has a different name there, it's considered, like, if one of them dies, it's considered a very a political omen, like a bad omen or something politically, and so they have to sort of do a big ritual to make sure that the sort of leadership of the particular village where the tree has died doesn't get deposed or something like that. So the tree seems to have this sort of power in places, but I think also just as a figure to think about ecology and culture, that, I mean, what you're saying about this sort of supposedly benevolent green, efforts, the idea that you can kind of like protect everything by displacing some people and making it, giving the trees the space. I don't know. You know,
It's a form
I
of
think that
museumizing, I think. Yeah.
it helps to think about the complexity of the whole situation, which is that, you know, we're in a situation where we're consuming more. I mean, even the green energies consume a lot of, you know, rare earth elements, tree, also wood chipping. There's all of these kinds of twists um, in the way that that in order to continue as we are, we just have to keep consuming. So I mean, it's just sort of points to the notion that there needs to be a kind of whole philosophical shift, like you were speaking of at the beginning of this talk. You know, that like it's not just a matter of finding another way to consume the way we're consuming. You know, it's and to be able to think sort of both individually and collectively is important. I think there's something about the way the tree is both a home to all of these species and a colonial force itself that displaces other things around it is an important lesson. You know, that maybe it has to teach us, right? That there's not a kind of monocultural solution to our 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 problem, and also to it as a figure of the imagination, also to go back to Amitav Ghosh. You know, there's this like need to try to figure out how to imagine in a magnitude that includes a complexity of thought. It's not just like, oh, we're going to find this one happy solution or something.
And yeah, I think the question of scale is a very important one in terms
Yeah.
of thinking whether we talk about individual histories or species histories or the species imaginations. But it's almost 4:55. So I wanted to sort of go back to the question of the museum. And I'm fascinated by the fact of how you activate the space of the museum, the exhibitionary complex. How do you activate the space of the museum? And I did not know that there was a taxidermy collection in the horizon. And
Right. Well, the taxidermy collection is not in the museum, but when I was looking up the history of the museum, Michael DeYoung actually wanted to open a museum because he had this collection of stuffed birds that he didn't know what to do with.
right.
He didn't know where to put them. So his idea was to open a museum to put them in, which he didn't raise the funds before. He had to sell the collection of birds before he could raise the funds. But it's sort of how he became a museum person and how the DeYoungs became this museum family in the Bay Area. And so I kind of wanted to think about that because that museum, you know, has this like 19th century model. And it's also an ethnographic model where there are these kind of sections of the museum that like represent different places. And, you know, I sort of always think about that when I'm putting things in a
I mean,
space.
it has a long history to the Kunstkammers of of the early modern period and the birth of natural history, and that
Mhm.
led to both where you collect naturalia, that is specimens from across the world, but uh, also I'm sorry, this is very difficult. So, mm,
You're getting pinged.
I'm getting pinged, and I am wondering how we. So, so yeah. So apparently we have questions,
Okay.
which
Well, I'm going to
is
just say one quick thing
yeah.
which is Black Panther came out when I was also making that work. And I couldn't not be thinking about the colonial history of the museum.
Right, and I think it's very interesting to sort of go back to this colonial history and sort of reactivate that history through new ways of thinking about human non-human interactions, thinking about indigenous epistemologies, thinking about how these other histories of plants, animals, rocks can take us beyond that sort of European early modern scientificism that really is the birth of modern rational thinking that has marginalized so many philosophical systems.
Yeah, yeah, and I thought, well, those birds, they're extinct, but they're still talking.
Right.
You know, they're saying a lot of things, just like some of these objects, they might have been sort of caged, but they still have, a lot to say. So what would they be saying? I mean, it was like asking a question of like, what do those birds have to say? I'm still asking that question.
And how do we even creatively think, going back to the question of Amitav Ghosh, the uh, question of how one talks about imagination.
Yeah, how do we imagine into this, and that's something I like to work on with myself and also with other people as
So,
much as
Ranu, so can you, Ranu? This is, I'm ventriculizing for the audience. Can you say more about how you engage with artists, dancers, with uncertainty without re-traumatizing? And
Oh,
also, can we relate Tagore's art and poetry to climate change? I'm
okay,
happy
wait.
to take a second question, but the first question is, can you say more about how you engage artists or dancers with uncertainty, without
No,
re-traumatizing?
re-traumatizing. That's something I'm asking myself a lot of questions about right now. The project that I was sort of thinking about when I talked about that is one that I worked on in the wake of the 2017 fires in California. And I was thinking, I had these dancers. I worked with Hope More Dance, and we worked with some dancers to improvise in the remains of the fires. And it was a way of trying to think about how if you just bury a trauma, it gets bigger. And if you let it become, it becomes an entire a weight. But there needs to be a way of kind of so I was thinking about the figure in the ground literally as a that the idea of the relationship between the figure and the ground is actually a critical relationship right now in this moment of history. And then at the moment, I'm trying to devise a project where I want to work with different populations, also with Hope More. And this project is called Ensemble for Nonlinear Time. And it's specifically trying to think very much about this, to work with people who are either resettled refugees or were lost things in the fire. And I think that we're all in this situation right now. So I'm kind of working with this for myself, but I'm trying to think a lot about the way rupture it can be a catalyst. And if you make rupture into a character, right? So I'm thinking a lot about speculative fiction, and if we take a rupture as a character and try to imagine how it moves, changes, what it does over time, in a way that we don't over identify with it. It doesn't become us. The trauma is not us. The trauma is something that happens and is moving over time, like this virus is happening right now. How do we sort of characterize it and then like listen to it? I mean, how do we understand how to listen to something traumatic and how to learn from it? So that's sort of my approach. I don't have an answer really about how to do that, but I think that that's part of what the work has been for me. So one of the things that I do also is to trace news images over and over again, and I sort of overlay them onto paper. And that's a way for me to kind of process a lot of traumatic news, but also to look at it in a way that's that doesn't um, trick me into thinking I actually know more than I do. So I think that I'm trying to kind of break down also our image culture in certain ways, because I think the way that like media images and also a lot of marketing works, which is what we're sort of saturated in, is that it works by kind of trying to convince culture that we know something, that things are certain. And so I think that we're sort of allergic to uncertainty. We're developing a sort of, I think we need more to have more capacity for uncertainty than the sort of dominant cultural modes, particularly visual culture, are giving us, right? So I think it's about sort of I'm actually expanding the capacity for uncertainty through art making for me. But I think that there's lots of ways to expand that capacity that maybe are other than art making.
Right. So Raj, I'm sorry, Raj asked, how do you relate Tagore's art and poetry to climate change? I mean, that's a very interesting question. And I just recently heard a talk by a very eminent historian, Dipesh Chakraborty, who was talking about Rabindranath Tagore's writing on trees and how Rabindranath Tagore wrote about becoming a tree. In my own work, I've written on art history and how in Shantiniketan, Kala Bhavan, the art school in Shantiniketan, this particular art historian called Stella Kramrisch reimagined Buddhist sculpture in terms of plants, not just in terms, because when we think about sculpture, and that's what we, let's say the history of sculpture, it's always about mapping the sculpture in terms of the human body. The human body, the logocentric body from the 16th century becomes the center of the universe. So even when we think about sculpture, we always map it to the human body. Now, Stella Kramrisch in the 1930s proposes this very interesting model of understanding Buddhist art through idea of transubstantiation, where she argues that the body of the Buddha becomes vegetal, becomes plant-like. So I think it's a very interesting way of thinking about sculpture, where we do not again privilege the human body. What does it mean for the Buddha to become a plant, and the human and the vegetal to merge and in immanent energy? So I think Shantiniketan and sort of the critical writing, the music, the poetry, the literature, the visual arts really offered us a way of thinking about climate change. And that not much has been written on it. I think it's a very interesting project to think about climate change, especially as it was developed by the Tagores in Shantiniketan.
Yeah.
So Joan asks, have you encountered Elinor Ostrom's work, demonstrating how local communities around the world almost always manage their local resources better than the governing body?
Sounds about right.
I mean, the critique of top-down development, I think it's very important, especially when we think about climate change. And it's a very important move that has to be made, that we cannot export North American notions of wilderness, and we have to think about other ways of engaging biodiversity that does not take us back to that early 20th century model. And I think a lot of nonprofits from across the global south have been pushing forward to think about new policies that involve local communities, local resources, and it just not being a trickle down effect from let's say the center in let's say in the case of South Asia. Well, we're almost out of time. Ranu, do you want to add something?
I want to just say one quick other thing about uncertainty, which is that I think that what we're talking about with these questions of like letting, having people to manage their own resources, or what I'm trying to get at by thinking with people who have been through some sort of major cataclysmic change, which now a lot of people have been through or going through, is this idea of expertise. And that, like, local or expertise. I mean, I think that, to ask people who have the expertise and rather than victimize them. So I feel like there's a sort of problem where most often people who are considered victims are actually experts. And maybe I'd leave it at that. Like, we need to talk to the experts or listen to the experts, and with non-human experts too. Like,
absolutely.
I mean, yeah.
Right. Well, big thanks to you, Ranu, for joining us virtually for today's Commonwealth Club program. As I noted earlier, this is the second in a series of programs between the Commonwealth Club and the Townsend Center for Humanities at Berkeley. The next program will be announced shortly. Please visit commonwealthclub.org to learn more. Thank you again. I'm Shugata Ray, and this virtual program of the Commonwealth Club The place where you are in the know is adjourned. Thank you.